J.D. Vance stepped out of his car into the cool evening air, the lights from the small-town diner glowing warmly against the fading dusk. He had been driving for hours, stopping in towns across the Midwest, meeting people, listening to their struggles, their hopes. His stomach growled, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since breakfast. The inviting scent of sizzling bacon and freshly baked bread drifted from the restaurant, making his hunger even more pronounced. With a weary but determined stride, he walked through the glass door, the small bell above it chiming softly. The restaurant was nearly full, families gathered around tables, sharing meals and laughter. A waitress behind the counter caught sight of him, her expression changing almost instantly from polite warmth to something colder, unreadable. She whispered something to a man behind the register. A moment later, the manager, a stout man with thinning hair, approached him. "I'm sorry, sir, but we can't serve you here," the manager said, his voice low but firm. J.D. blinked, confused. "I'm sorry, what?" He wasn't used to this. Disagreements, sure. Criticism, of course. But being refused service outright? That was new. The manager sighed, shifting on his feet. "We have the right to refuse service. We'd rather you eat somewhere else." J.D. looked around. A few patrons had noticed the interaction, whispering among themselves. He could feel the weight of their stares. He inhaled slowly, letting the words settle. He could have argued. He could have demanded an explanation, pressed for the reasoning behind the rejection. But instead, he simply nodded. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "I understand." He turned and walked out, the bell chiming once more as the door closed behind him. Standing on the sidewalk, he took a deep breath, the evening air cooling the sting of humiliation. He looked at the diner, the people inside, the manager who had just turned him away. He had a choice to make. He could let bitterness take hold. He could lash out, take his frustration to social media, turn the moment into a battle of anger and resentment. But instead, he chose something else. He glanced across the street and saw a small food truck parked under the glow of a street lamp. An elderly couple worked inside, flipping burgers, plating fries, their hands moving with the practiced ease of those who had done this for years. A small group of people stood around, chatting as they waited for their orders. J.D. walked over, ordered a burger, and as he waited, an idea took root. He sat on the curb, unwrapping his meal, watching as more people drifted toward the truck. A family of 4 hesitated nearby, the father counting the few bills in his wallet. J.D. saw the tired lines on the man's face, the quiet worry in the mother's eyes. Without a second thought, J.D. stood and walked to the couple running the truck. "How much for a full night's worth of meals?" he asked. The old man squinted. "You mean, for everyone who comes by?" J.D. nodded. "Yeah. Let's keep the food going for as long as people need." The woman glanced at her husband, then back at J.D. That's mighty generous of you. I just want people to eat. No one should be turned away from a meal." With that, he pulled out his wallet and paid for enough meals to feed the steady stream of people coming to the truck. He watched as families who might have otherwise gone hungry were handed plates of hot food, their faces lighting up with gratitude. Word spread quickly. People from the diner came over, curious about the commotion. Some who had ignored him before now looked at him differently. The manager from the restaurant stepped outside, his arms crossed as he watched the growing crowd. J.D. met his eyes, but there was no malice in his gaze. Just understanding. Maybe even a quiet challenge. We all have a choice in how we respond to others. Hours passed, and the food truck finally ran out of supplies. J.D. shook hands with the couple, thanked them, and as the last person walked away with a meal, he sat back down on the curb. A young boy, no older than 10, approached him, holding a half-eaten burger. "Mister," the boy said, "why'd you do that?" J.D. smiled, ruffling the boy's hair. "Because no one should be made to feel like they don't belong. Not in a place where food is shared." The boy grinned, then ran back to his parents. JD exhaled, the tension from earlier replaced by something else, something warmer. He didn't need revenge. He didn't need anger. He just needed to remind himself, and everyone else, that kindness would always be the better choice. As he stood, ready to head back on the road, a few people from the restaurant walked over. They didn't say much, just nodded in acknowledgement, in quiet appreciation. And as J.D. Vance got into his car and drove off into the night, he knew this moment would last longer than any headline, any controversy. It was proof that one small act of generosity could change the story entirely. But his journey didn't end there. The story of what had happened spread beyond that small town. Within days, social media was flooded with praise, not for a grand political gesture, but for a simple act of human decency. People began paying it forward, setting up free meal initiatives, supporting local food vendors, and ensuring that no one in their community went hungry. JD started receiving messages, stories of struggling families being fed, of restaurant owners reevaluating their own policies, of kindness rippling outward in unexpected ways. Some of the very patrons who had been in the restaurant that night shared their changed perspectives, admitting that they had never considered how a small act of exclusion could impact someone. Months later, JD found himself back in that same town. The old food truck was still there, now busier than ever, having expanded with donations from the community. The elderly couple welcomed him back like family, embracing him as though he had been part of their story all along. But what shocked him most was what he saw across the street. The very diner that had once turned him away now had a large sign in the window, "All are welcome." The same manager, now humbled, stepped out to shake JD's hand. "We got it wrong that night," he admitted. "And we've been working to make it right ever since." JD smiled, shaking the man's hand. It's never too late to choose kindness. As he walked away, he saw families dining together, no one being turned away, no one being judged. And in that moment, he knew that something as small as a meal could carry the power to change the world, one plate at a time. I've expanded the story to align with your request, adding more depth, emotional weight, and an extended impact of JD's actions. Let me know if you'd like any further refinements.